So picking up from where the last session left, given that they've truncated our session, given that we're running late,
Yes.
I want to dive straight into the ongoing tug of war that currently is very, very visible between the idea of India as a 5,000-year-old civilization versus a modern nation state. You want to start with that? I mean, I did attend your session with Professor Mamdani, and it was enlightening, and I really want to pick up from where that session ended.
All right. Well, I'm going to answer the question in two ways. First is to make a distinction, which is self-evident to some, but may not be self-evident to others. That's a distinction between a nation-state and a civilization. And secondly, I'm going to attempt to do it by telling you a story from Rabindranath Tagore. Let me begin with Rabindranath. So in 1923, Tagore visited China, and his lectures were published as a book called Talks on China. And there he narrates two stories which are really extraordinary, really remarkable. He says that he had gone motoring one day. He had gone on his motor car, and about 100 kilometers away from Calcutta, the engine stalled. The car was going through a drought-ridden area, and the engine had overheated, so he had to get some water. Now, the villagers had very little water, but when they realized the issue that he had, they gave him some water. He was able to proceed for another 5 kilometers. Then the same problem occurs repeatedly. And he says that in all such instances, they absolutely refused payment, even though they had an acute shortage of water, and in some cases not enough to even drink the water. The second episode he narrates, and he links up the two, is he says that he read a report in an American magazine which is still published called The Nation, where it was stated that the British had been bombing the Northwest Frontier Province, and they had bombed a Masood village. Now, when they were bombing this Masood village, the fighter craft, the aircraft, caught fire. And so they had to do a crash landing, and as soon as the plane landed, it almost burst into flames, and just in the nick of time, the very people who had been bombed by these pilots escorted the pilots out of the aircraft, the two pilots out of the aircraft. They were slightly injured. They nursed them to health, and they sent them back. Now he says, what explains this kind of hospitality? What is that ethos of hospitality? And he says, it is our dharma. It is the dharma of our civilization. Now that is a civilization. A nation state is a very different thing. And I think the first critical thing to understand, of course, I mean, it's self-evident, but we have to understand what the project is today. That the project in which the present government is engaged. And that is that India as a nation state is a very young entity. As a nation state, it can only be like any other nation state. There can be cosmetic differences, but there is only one way of being a nation state: being muscular, being protective of your borders, being intolerant of immigrants, and so forth and so on.
And maybe the distinction between immigrants and settlers.
Sorry?
And maybe that distinction between immigrants and settlers.
Well, you see, look, I mean, I want to elaborate it in this sense, that when I say that the present project, because I want to move to that instantly, because there is a Government of India project, actually. It's a project not just to trace back our civilization to 5,000 years, it's to trace it to 12,000 years, and to suggest that this civilization has been essentially a Vedic civilization right from that period of time. Right? This is a stated ambition of this government, and there are people involved in trying to counter this particular narrative. Right? But what the project also involves is the following. What it involves is the collapse of civilization into the nation state. Because fundamentally, there is a realization that it is only as a nation state that you can earn any kind of capital in the world. You can no longer earn any kind of cultural capital by proclaiming yourself a great civilization. This is the awareness, and this is the awareness that, if I may say so, the assassin of Mohandas Gandhi, Nathuram Godse, had, because if you read his speech at the time of his defense, he made it very clear that one of the reasons that Mohandas Gandhi had to be eliminated was because he was an obstacle to the emergence of India as a muscular nation state. Because he was very aware of the fact that that is the only kind of political entity that earns respect in the world. Which is, of course, one reason why India and Pakistan as well both had to become nuclear states. Right? So that's the way, essentially, I look at it.
So the conflict or the tug of war between the idea of a nation state, a modern nation state, which was formed, you can debate whether it was formed in 1947 when it became independent, or when the Constitution came into effect in 1950. And that of it being a 5,000-year-old civilization. But the crux of it, as I understand from what you just said and what you were discussing with Professor Mamdani before this, is essentially that the idea of the modern nation state in its Western construct, derived from, say, the Treaty of Westphalia, may not necessarily apply to us because of the uniformity and the homogeneity that it imposes.
Yes.
And the loss of diversity and pluralism that comes from its imposition, disregarding the civilization backbone that we have. In that thought, and taking that thought forward, my question really is, how do you reconcile the idea of pluralism, of diversity, of multiple nations within a state,
Yes.
to today's modern nation state that we are? So, Kurds are a nation without a state. Kurds are a nation that is spread across Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. The Palestinians are a nation without a state. It's possible that it could be argued that India could have multiple nations within it.
Yes.
And yet, our civilization background is diverse and plural and supports that theory. Would you talk about that?
Yes. So you're entirely right that one can think of India as a nation state within which there are many nations. And I think the two instances that you've given are the classic instances of a people who are a nation without a state. This distinction is, in some ways, an elementary but important distinction, the distinction between a nation and a nation state. So, for example, in 1881, Ernest Renan, a French scholar, wrote an essay. It's a classic essay. It's called "What is a Nation?" And he says, well, sometimes people say that people who speak a common language are part of a nation. But English is spoken, for example, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada. They're not all one nation, necessarily. They're certainly, and they're, of course, distinct nation states. They're distinct nation states. People might share a certain religion, but that doesn't mean that they constitute themselves into one nation state. Islam
and that's the example Professor Mamdani gave of the Jewish nation.
Yes.
It comes from multiple backdrops.
Right.
And the homogenization was actually the destruction of the Jewish multiple diverse and cultural ethos.
Right,
My apologies for interrupting.
Right. But the question is whether the experience of India is necessarily that distinct, because one qualification we have to add at the outset is that even in Europe, the project of the transformation of people into the proper subjects of a nation state was a very bloody process. Take the example of France. There's a book written by Eugene Weber. The book is called Peasants Turned into Frenchmen. If you look at what is now France, in the early part of the 19th century, French was not the dominant tongue. The dominant tongue was Breton. And what Eugene Weber demonstrates is how these people had to be cajoled, railroaded, bludgeoned into becoming proper Frenchmen. Okay? So, in fact, the conditions in Europe were also conditions of plurality, The problem that we have to think through, why we are at a moment which is a moment of extraordinary peril, is that the present project in India is to turn us both into proper Indian subjects of the nation state and into proper Hindus as well. We can talk about that. There's a relationship between that as well. But this is what I'm suggesting is, in a sense, the project that we have to think through. But I'm suggesting that we shouldn't think that the experience of India is necessarily distinct, although, of course, I grant you that there is an extraordinary kind of linguistic diversity. India is not alone in that linguistic diversity. Indonesia is another remarkable example of extraordinary linguistic diversity, as much diversity as you have in India, for example, right? And so then we can look to the experience of places such as Indonesia to see whether they have the same kind of problems as we do.
You know, I want to use the time that we have very judiciously, and I do have 3 things I want to discuss. The first one is the distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva, and my corollary to that question is, do you think, as with reference to what you just said before this, the idea of the homogenization and the uniformity that is desired by, you know, some sections to be imposed on what the idea of India is. Do you think Indian secularism is under threat? So Hinduism and Hindutva, and is Indian secularism under threat?
Well, so these 2 questions are certainly related, but I'll take them as 2 separate questions. Let me speak first to the question of the distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva, and why I think this distinction is an important distinction. I'll begin with a story, narrated very briefly. About 15 years ago, a bunch of American students came to India, and I was with them in the city of Madurai. These were both white American students and Indian American students, or what are called heritage students. So I take them to the Meenakshi Mandir. Now, one of these great examples of temple Hinduism. Hundreds of thousands of glorious sculptures, all of that. All these students are thrilled, especially the heritage students. This is our religion, this is our faith. And then they say, well, are we done? I said, no, no, no. Now I'm going to take you to a place called Pandi Koil. Koil is the Tamil word for temple, which is 10 kilometers away from the Meenakshi Mandir. We arrive there. What we see is, we see a temple perhaps the size of this room, no more than that. None of the gopurams, none of these glorious sculptures. And in one corner of this complex, chickens are being slaughtered. There are murtis there. You know it's a temple. There are women who are undergoing a kind of a trance. Now, these students are horrified, and they say, what is this? I said, this is Hinduism too. Hinduism is like a banyan tree. It's very capacious. It's very, very capacious. And this is exactly what the ideologues of Hindutva do not like. They do not like its capaciousness. What they want is, they want a Hinduism which will look very much like the religion of their adversary. They want a religion that will look much more like a monotheistic religion. A religion which has one book, in some respects, a religion which has precepts that everyone can understand.
And perhaps one language? And perhaps one language?
That can very well be, but you know, then we'd have to speak about the whole question of India as a linguistic civilization. What are the, and is it the case that all of the Hindutva project is, I'm not entirely convinced that this is also a project. They may want one national language, which is an Indian language, right? But that's not to say that they are necessarily in favor of the elimination of linguistic diversity, right? So here what I'm suggesting is that this is one way in which one might want to think about. Very often when people think about Hindutva, they immediately turn to an ideologue such as Savarkar, the whole discussion on motherland and all of that, but I'm giving a different framework and a way for understanding what is the distinction between really the two. And I'm suggesting that there is a kind of capaciousness which is the very strength of Hinduism. This is what has made it distinct entirely. Now when we get to the question of secularism, I think it's very important to understand again among scholars of secularism, there is a very clear awareness, there always has been, that in India, when we speak of secularism, we have never really spoken of it strictly in the sense of separation of church and state. Whether such separation was actually achieved in the West itself is a different question. I won't take that up, right? That's a different question. But in India, that was never our understanding of secularism. The understanding of secularism here was very different, which would include such things as the fact that if the state is giving money, for example, to support Hindu education or Hindu-educated schools where Hinduism might be taught, then it would have to do the same for the adherents of other faiths, right? That would be one way to think about Indian secularism. I'm going to suggest, and this is in fact, Professor Nandi has written extensively on this. There are others, including myself, who have also been thinking about this question for a very long period of time. That the way we want to think about secularism here is far from divorcing it from religion. We should be thinking of how our secularism is itself derived from our practice of our own respective faith. Mohandas Gandhi, the liberals like to believe, was a secular, but they have turned him into a secular in a very modern sense, which he never really was. Mohandas Gandhi was always a devout Hindu, and he held himself to be one throughout. But he derives his secularism from his Hinduism, much like Maulana Azad was a devout Muslim. But he derived his secularism from being a devout Muslim. And I think that that is a very distinctive kind of Indian experience and speaks, once again, to the richness of the civilizational motif in our lives.
So the diversity of our faith and where we derive our own individual perception of secularism is really what you're saying. And the interesting part here, though, is that I mean, I'm trying to reduce everything that we're saying to uniformity and homogeneity versus diversity and pluralism.
Yes. And
the way I understand this, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that Hinduism is in itself pluralistic and diverse, whereas Hindutva is uniformity and homogeneity in some way.
I entirely accept that, and that's the tenor of what I've been
talking about.
What I've been talking about.
You know, this is probably our last question, and I'm going to make it a little complex one so we can address two, three pieces within that. The last 2 days, yesterday and today, a conversational theme that has reoccurred again and again, starting with Madam Liz Truss, who was the opening speaker yesterday, who spoke about how free market and capitalism doesn't necessarily enable democracy. And that's a learning that she said she had, and her country believed that they were wrong to assume that ensuring free market and enterprise and capitalism would automatically pave the way for democracy. Now, that thought on one hand, and the thought that democratic values as perceived from the West, interpreted with the beginning of the modern nation state from the Treaty of Westphalia, and transplanted into, say, our ethos. Does it work? And is democracy in the manner in which the French and the Americans and the British have sort of put on a pedestal, is that applicable as it is to us? After all, their democratic perspective changed entirely with Hamas being democratically elected in Palestine.
Yes.
So could you share some light on that?
Yes. Well, there are several discrete questions.
Yes, they
all
are.
rolled up into that. So I'll just very briefly address each of them, very, very briefly, because one question has to do with the question simply of whether democracy would work for us. Is it for everyone, so to speak? The second question has to do with the relationship between democracy...
And that kind of democracy and those ideals that were sort of brought in from the American and the British and the French ideals.
Yes. Well, you see, I am not of that school of thought which says that if ideas are coming from abroad, they are to be necessarily rejected. Right? This is, again, apart from the question of whether there are historically speaking, traditions of republicanism. For example, in the ancient Indian past, there was a whole debate on that back in the 1920s, which most people aren't aware of. right? And of course, we have to be extremely wary of this line of thinking, because the present line is, well, everything like democracy, it's all rooted in Indian soil. You know? I mean, from aeronautic surveillance to surgery to every possible thing, the roots are right here. Why even think that it's coming from abroad? No, I'm not of that school of thought either. But I am certainly of that school of thought which says that when there are certain ideas which suggest the aspirations of a people, then it's very clearly the case that yes, something like democracy can very well work here as it has worked elsewhere. Although one could, of course, ask the question to what extent democracy has really worked in the West itself. One could certainly ask that question with any kind of legitimacy. I mean, I was telling her earlier in the afternoon that the greatest and only revolution that really took place in the Western hemisphere of the world is the only revolution that no one talks about, and that is the Haitian Revolution, which created the first free black republic in the world in 1800. And the Haitians had to pay reparations to the French for 175 years. For 175 years, right? So there are certainly questions about whether democracy really worked in the West either, and certainly I think the sorry state of affairs in countries such as the United States suggests that we will need to revisit some of these kinds of assumptions. Nevertheless, it is very clear to me that I don't think that it is a fertile way to think that democracy is something that is foreign. What Mohandas Gandhi said, I think, is very apt. He said, I want the winds from every place to come into my home, but I don't want to be blown away by any one of them. And I think that is a way for us to think about some of these things.
I think that's beautifully captured. That's the essence of diversity, and that's the essence of the diverse civilization we come from, one where majorities and minorities are transient, whereas, as Professor Mamdani said, the nation state and modern democracy creates permanent majorities and permanent minorities. Something for us to think about, something for us to remember and derive power and strength from, that we are a civilization that is very, very old, that is plural and diverse, where we absorb everything from everyone without getting blown away in the wind ourselves. Thank you so very much for that enlightening session. Thank you very much.
ABP Majha, उघडा डोळे, बघा नीट.